Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1810 London. In a narrow house on Vere Street, just off Oxford Street, men are gathering in secret. They drink, they dance, they kiss in shadowy alcoves, and in 6 months the British state will destroy every single one of them. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other, and tonight we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian, this is Gay Timeline. In July of 1810, in a cramped upstairs room at the White Swan public house on Vere Street, a man named James Cook was adjusting his wig. He was 47 years old. He worked as a porter during the day, hauling crates and boxes through the filthy streets of Covent Garden. His hands were calloused. His back ached. But tonight, he wore rouge on his cheeks and a gown borrowed from God knows where, and he was about to dance with a sailor named Thomas White. The room smelled of cheap gin, tobacco smoke, and sweat. Maybe 30 men were crammed into a space meant for half that many. Some wore women's clothing. Most did not. A few couples disappeared into the small back rooms, little more than closets with straw mattresses thrown on the floor. No one asked questions. No one needed to. This was the White Swan. This was safety. Or so they believed. Thomas White was 22. He had joined the Royal Navy at 14, served on ships where men slept packed together in hammocks, so close you could feel the breath of the sailor beside you. He knew what happened below decks. He knew the unspoken rules. But here, in this cramped molly house on Vere Street, no one pretended. No one whispered. Men held hands openly. They called each other by women's names: Kitty, Fanny, Miss Sweet Lips. They kissed in full view of a room full of strangers who would never, ever betray them. Or so they believed. To understand what the White Swan was, you have to understand something the history books rarely explain clearly. Molly houses were not brothels in the traditional sense. They were private clubs, meeting places, the 18th century equivalent of a gay bar, except instead of a rainbow flag out front, there was a man at the door who knew exactly who to let in and who to turn away. They existed in legal twilight, not quite illegal to enter, utterly illegal to do what happened inside. And what happened inside was love, and sex, and community, and terrible, stupid, glorious joy. Now, before you settle in, if you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you, but only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to Vere Street. By the end of tonight, you will know why a London porter named James Cook opened a molly house, why the men who loved there called themselves mollies, and what happened when the doors were smashed open by the law on a summer night in 1810. You will know their names. You will know what they wore, what they drank, what they whispered to each other in the dark. And you will know what the British state did to them when it decided their love was a crime worth hanging for. Let us begin. James Cook did not set out to run a molly house. He set out to run a public house. That is what he told the magistrate later anyway, and it was probably even true. The White Swan, at number 31 Vere Street, was a perfectly ordinary London pub when Cook took over the lease in late 1809. Small, dark, the kind of place where workingmen stopped for a pint on their way home, the kind of place no one would look at twice. But James Cook had a gift. He knew people. He knew the men who lingered a little too long at the bar, the ones whose eyes followed other men across the room. He knew the codes, the glances, the carefully neutral phrases that meant everything if you knew how to listen. And slowly, quietly, the White Swan became something else. By early 1810, it was the most famous molly house in London. The term molly is slippery. Historians argue about where it came from. Some say it derived from the Latin mollis, meaning soft. Others think it came from the name Mary or Moll, a common nickname for working-class women. What matters is what it meant on the streets of Georgian London. A molly was a man who desired other men. A molly house was where they gathered. And the molly culture that flourished in 18th and early 19th century London was an entire hidden world. A subculture with its own language, its own rituals, its own fierce, fragile sense of identity. Richter Norton, the historian who has done more than anyone to document London's molly houses, spent decades digging through Old Bailey trial records, newspapers, and court transcripts. What he found was astonishing. By 1810, there were at least a dozen molly houses operating in London at any given time. Maybe more. They clustered in certain neighbourhoods: Holborn, Covent Garden, the Docks. Places where anonymity was easy, where a man could slip through a doorway and disappear. The White Swan was not the oldest. It was not the largest. But it was, for a brief and shining moment, the most beloved. James Cook understood something essential. These men did not just want sex. They wanted community. They wanted a place where they could be themselves, without fear, without performance, without the crushing weight of pretending to be something they were not. So Cook gave them that. He hired a pianist. He kept the gin cheap and the back rooms private. He turned a blind eye when men arrived in dresses, when they painted their faces, when they slow danced together in the upstairs room with the shutters drawn tight against the street. And the men came. God, how they came. On a good night, the White Swan held 30, 40, sometimes 50 men, labourers and sailors, clerks and shopkeepers, a few wealthier men slumming it, dressed down so they would not stand out. The historian Hugh Trevor Roper once noted that Georgian London had a strange kind of class mobility in its underworld. Molly houses were among the few places where a lord and a lamplighter might drink side by side, united by the simple fact that the world outside wanted them dead. They called each other by camp names: Fanny, Kitty, Molly, Miss Thing. It was part theatre, part protection. If the wrong person overheard, you could claim you were talking about a woman, but it was also something else. It was joy. It was the pleasure of renaming yourself, of choosing your own identity in a world that gave you none. Some of the men wore dresses, not all, not even most, but enough that it became a defining feature of molly culture in the popular imagination, and, later, in the courtroom. The dresses were not drag in the modern sense. They were not polished performances. They were scraps, borrowed gowns, petticoats stitched together from cast-offs. The men who wore them were not trying to pass as women. They were playing. They were performing a kind of femininity that mocked the very idea of gender as fixed, as natural, as God-given. This terrified the authorities more than almost anything else. Because if a man could put on a dress and still be a man, if he could kiss another man and still be a man, then what did manhood even mean? The whole social order rested on the idea that men were men and women were women, and the roles were fixed by nature and law and scripture. Molly houses obliterated that. They turned gender into a costume. They turned desire into a choice. They turned the natural order into a joke. And the British state did not tolerate jokes. Thomas White did not wear dresses. He wore the clothing of his class: rough wool trousers, a linen shirt, a coat that had seen better days. But he loved a man who did. His name was John Dix. He was 28. He worked as a coal heaver, one of the men who unloaded coal from the ships on the Thames and hauled it through the freezing winter streets. It was brutal work. It left your lungs black and your body broken by 40. John Dix was not yet broken. The two men met at the White Swan in March of 1810. They danced, they drank, They disappeared into one of the back rooms for 20 minutes and emerged flushed and smiling. Over the following weeks, they returned again and again, sometimes together, sometimes alone, but always searching for each other across the crowded room. We know this because Thomas White testified about it later, under oath, in a courtroom packed with spectators who wanted to watch him hang. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Spring in London, 1810. The city smelled of coal smoke and horse manure and the Thames at low tide, which is to say it smelled like death warmed over. The streets were narrow and filthy. The air was thick with soot. If you were poor, and most people were, you lived in rooms so small you could touch both walls at once. You shared a bed with your siblings, or your co-workers, or strangers who paid a penny a night for a place to sleep. Privacy was a luxury. Silence was impossible. Which made the Molly houses miraculous. Because inside the White Swan, you had privacy. You had silence, or at least the kind of silence that comes from a room full of people who will never, ever tell. You had the radical, dangerous, intoxicating experience of being exactly who you were. And then the law came. On the night of July 8, 1810, the Bow Street runners raided the White Swan. The Bow Street runners were not quite police. Britain did not have a professional police force yet, but they were close. They were thief-takers, constables, enforcers of the law. They worked for the magistrates at Bow Street, and they were very, very good at their jobs. They had been watching the White Swan for weeks. They had planted informants inside. They had documented who came and went. They had built a case, and on a warm summer night, they kicked in the door. The raid happened just after midnight. The upstairs room was full. Men were dancing, men were drinking, men were kissing in the corners, hands fumbling at buttons and belts. The runners came through the door like a wave, truncheons out, shouts, chaos. Some men tried to run. A few made it out the back, most did not. The runners were methodical. They grabbed men by the collar and dragged them downstairs. They searched the back rooms and found couples tangled together in the dark. They took names. They took descriptions. They arrested 23 men that night. James Cook, the proprietor, was arrested first. He did not resist. He stood in the centre of the room, still wearing his apron, and watched as his world came apart. Thomas White was arrested trying to climb out a window. A runner caught him by the ankle and hauled him back inside. John Dix was arrested in one of the back rooms. Still half undressed, he was crying. The transcripts note this. They note everything. The men were marched through the streets to the Bow Street magistrate's office. It was after 1 a.m. The streets were not empty. London never slept. And the people who saw the procession, 23 men in manacles, some still in dresses, escorted by grim-faced runners, knew exactly what they were seeing. By dawn, a crowd had gathered outside the magistrate's office. They threw stones. They shouted. The word Molly was spat like a curse. This is the part of the story where I need to tell you what the law said. Because the law is what killed them. Sodomy, defined as anal penetration between men, had been a capital crime in England since 1533. The Buggery Act, passed under Henry VIII, made it punishable by death. For nearly 300 years the law stood. Hundreds of men were executed under it. Thousands more were pilloried, imprisoned, or transported to the colonies. But here is the thing. Sodomy convictions were rare. Not because sodomy was rare, it was not, but because the law required proof. You needed witnesses. You needed evidence of penetration. You needed, in the language of the courts, proof of omission, which is a polite way of saying you needed to prove that one man had climaxed inside another. This was nearly impossible to prove unless you caught men in the act, which meant most men arrested for sodomy-related offences were charged with attempted sodomy or assault with sodomitical intent, or, most commonly, keeping a disorderly house. James Cook was charged with keeping a disorderly house. The others were charged with attempted sodomy, indecent behaviour, or conspiracy to commit sodomy. Only 2 men, whose names were Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis, were charged with the capital crime itself. The prosecution claimed it had witnesses who had seen them in flagrante. The trial began on September 19, 1810, at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed. Trials involving sodomy always drew crowds. The public gallery was standing room only. The press was there. The proceedings of the Old Bailey, the published trial transcripts that documented every major criminal case in London, recorded the whole thing in meticulous detail. We have it still. We can read the exact words spoken in that courtroom. We can hear the voices of the men who were about to be destroyed. The prosecution opened with a simple argument. These men, it said, had committed acts of gross indecency. They had gathered for the purpose of sodomy. They had corrupted public morals. They had violated the laws of God and nature. They deserved the harshest punishment the law allowed. The defense, such as it was, argued that the men had been entrapped, that the runners' informants had encouraged the behavior they now claimed to be prosecuting, that the evidence was circumstantial, that no actual sodomy had occurred. It did not matter. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. James Cook was found guilty of keeping a disorderly house, sentenced to 2 years in prison and 1 hour in the pillory. 6 other men were sentenced to the pillory as well, for terms ranging from 30 minutes to 1 hour. Their names were William Amos, Philip Sedgwick, James Dunn, Richard Barlow, Edward Engelbert, and John Newbolt Church. Some of these names appear only in the trial transcripts. We know almost nothing else about them. We know they were there. We know they were punished. We know some of them did not survive. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were found guilty of sodomy, sentenced to death by hanging. Thomas White turned King's evidence. He testified against the others in exchange for his freedom. The transcripts record his testimony in full. He named names. He described what he had seen in the back rooms. He told the court about John Dix, about the nights they had spent together, about the things they had whispered in the dark. John Dix was sentenced to the pillory. We do not know if Thomas White ever saw him again. The pillory was not a joke. It was not a humiliation. It was a death sentence carried out by a mob. On September 27, 1810, the condemned men were taken to the pillory in Haymarket. A massive crowd gathered. Thousands of people. The proceedings describe it as one of the largest crowds ever assembled for a pillory punishment. The people brought rotting vegetables, dead animals, stones, bricks, buckets of human waste collected from the cesspits. The men were locked into the wooden frames, their heads and hands trapped, unable to move, unable to shield themselves. And the crowd let loose. They threw everything. Vegetables first, then the dead cats, the entrails, the excrement, then the stones. The proceedings note that several men were struck in the face hard enough to break bones. One man, William Amos, lost an eye. Another, James Dunn, was knocked unconscious within the first 10 minutes. The crowd cheered. James Cook stood in the pillory for a full hour. He survived. Barely. His face was a ruin of cuts and bruises. One report said he was unrecognizable when they finally pulled him down. John Dix stood for 30 minutes. He was 28 years old. He had worked the coal ships since he was a boy. He had loved a man named Thomas White who had betrayed him to save his own life. He stood in the pillory and the crowd screamed molly at him and threw stones until he stopped moving. He survived the pillory. He did not survive the aftermath. He died in prison 3 weeks later. The records list the cause of death as fever, but the records lie. He died because the mob broke him. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were hanged outside Newgate Prison on November 7, 1810. They were not the only men executed that day. Hangings were public spectacles, and the authorities liked to batch them together for efficiency. But they were the ones the crowd came to see, the ones the newspapers wrote about. The Morning Chronicle called them wretches. The Times called them criminals against nature. They were 24 and 31 years old. Their bodies were left hanging for an hour as a warning. Then they were cut down and buried in unmarked graves. The White Swan was shut down permanently. The building was sold. The new owner turned it into a respectable lodging house. Within a year, no one would admit to knowing it had ever been anything else. And the men scattered. The ones who survived. The ones who had not been arrested, or who had been released, or who had run fast enough when the runners came through the door. They disappeared back into the anonymous crowds of London. They found new molly houses, or they stopped going altogether. They married women and lived double lives. They learned to be more careful. They learned that safety was an illusion. Or they did not learn. Some men kept going to the molly houses, kept taking the risk, kept insisting that they had a right to love who they loved, even if the law said otherwise. Richter Norton found records of at least 15 other molly house raids in London between 1810 and 1830. Hundreds of men arrested, dozens executed or transported, thousands more pilloried, beaten, ruined. And still the molly houses opened, still the men gathered, still they danced and drank and kissed in the shadows, and called each other Kitty and Fanny and Miss Sweetlips, and held on to each other like the world outside did not exist. Because for a few hours, in a room with the shutters drawn and the door locked, and 30 men who understood exactly what you were risking just by being there, the world outside did not exist. That was the gift of the white swan. Not safety, not secrecy, but the temporary, fragile, precious illusion of freedom. And that is what the British state could not tolerate. Now, let us talk about what Molly meant, not just as a word, but as an identity, because this is where the story gets strange and complicated and utterly fascinating. In the trial transcripts, in the newspaper reports, in the pamphlets and broadsides that circulated after the Vere Street raid, the Mollys are described in language dripping with contempt. They are called effeminate, unnatural, disgusting. They are accused of aping women, of degrading manhood, of inverting the proper order of things. But when you read the actual testimonies, the words of the Mollys themselves recorded under oath, you hear something else. You hear defiance. You hear wit. You hear men who knew exactly what they were and refused to apologize for it. One witness, a man named Thomas Wainwright, was asked by the prosecutor why he had attended the White Swan. His answer, recorded in the proceedings, "Because I wanted to dance with men who would not judge me for it." Another man, asked to describe the atmosphere inside the Molly house, said, "It was the only place in London where I could breathe. These are not the words of men who hated themselves. These are the words of men who had found something worth risking their lives for." The historian Randolph Trumbach has argued that Molly culture represented one of the first recognizable forms of modern gay identity in Western history. Not just men who had sex with men, that had always existed, but men who understood themselves as fundamentally different from other men because of their desires. Men who built communities around that difference, who created rituals and language and spaces that affirmed it. The Mollys called each other by women's names, but they did not think they were women. They called their gatherings marriages, but they were not trying to mimic heterosexual marriage. They were inventing something new, something that did not yet have a name. They were inventing us. Think about that for a moment. In 1810, in a city where the death penalty hung over your head for the crime of loving another man, these men gathered anyway. They created a culture. They invented names for themselves. They built spaces where they could exist openly, even if only for a few hours at a time. And they did it without any of the framework we have today. No movement, no pride, no language of orientation or identity. They did not call themselves gay. That word would not acquire its modern meaning for another century. They did not call themselves homosexual. That term would not be coined until 1869 in Germany by a Hungarian writer named Karl Maria Kurt-Benny. They called themselves Mollys, and that word carried weight enough. The White Swan was not the first Molly house in London, not even close. The Molly house tradition stretched back at least to the 1720s, possibly earlier. The most famous raid before Vere Street happened in 1726 at a Molly house called Mother Clapp's, run by a woman named Margaret Clapp in Field Lane, Holborn. Margaret Clapp was extraordinary. She was not a Molly herself. She was a married woman, middle-aged, working class. But she ran a Molly house out of her home for years. She provided the space. She kept the drinks flowing. She protected the men who gathered there. And when the authorities raided the house and arrested dozens of men, she refused to testify against them. She was convicted of keeping a disorderly house and sentenced to the pillory. She stood in the pillory in 1726, and the crowd pelted her with filth and stones for 2 hours. She survived. Barely. The records say she was carried away unconscious, her face unrecognizable. Why did she do it? Why did she risk everything to protect men she was not even related to, whose desires she did not share? The trial transcripts record her answer. The prosecutor asked her why she had allowed such wickedness under her roof. She said, "Because they had nowhere else to go." That sentence stayed in the records for nearly 300 years. Because they had nowhere else to go. Margaret Clapp understood something the law did not. That these men were not monsters. They were not criminals. They were human beings who needed a place to exist. And if the world would not give them that place, then she would. 84 years later, James Cook did the same thing. He gave them a place, and the world destroyed him for it. The men who gathered at the White Swan came from every corner of London. We know some of their names. We know their occupations. We know scraps of their lives, preserved in the cold language of the law. William Amos was a shoemaker, 32 years old, married with 2 children. He had been visiting Molly houses for years. He knew the risks. He went anyway. After the pillory, after he lost his eye, he was released from prison and vanished from the records. We do not know what happened to him. We do not know if his wife took him back. We do not know if his children ever learned why their father came home broken. Philip Sedgwick was a clerk in a shipping office near the docks, 26, unmarried. He wrote letters, beautiful letters, the kind that survive in archives because someone thought they were worth keeping. One of those letters was entered into evidence at his trial. It was addressed to a man named Charles, surname unknown. The letter is 3 pages long. It talks about ordinary things, the weather, the price of coal, a play Sedgwick had seen at Drury Lane. And then, in the final paragraph, it says, "I think of you constantly. I would give anything to see you again. The things we shared in that small room are the only moments of my life I would not trade for all the riches of the world." The prosecutor read that letter aloud in court. The gallery laughed. Philip Sedgwick stood in the pillory for 45 minutes. He survived. He was released. 6 months later, he was arrested again at a different Molly house in Southwark. This time he was convicted of attempted sodomy and transported to Australia. He was 27 years old. He died on the ship before it reached port. Fever, the records say. Always fever. James Dunn was a sailor. Royal Navy, like Thomas White, 31. He had served on the HMS Victory at Trafalgar in 1805, the battle where Nelson died. He had survived cannon fire and storms and scurvy and the brutal violence of shipboard life. He had survived Trafalgar, one of the most famous naval battles in history, and 5 years later he was killed by a London mob for the crime of kissing another man. He did not die in the pillory. Not quite. He died 3 days later, in Newgate Prison, from injuries sustained when a brick struck him in the temple. The newspapers did not report it. The authorities did not investigate. He was a Molly. He did not matter. Except, he did. He mattered to someone. We know this because someone paid for his burial. Someone arranged for his body to be taken from the prison and buried in a churchyard in Shoreditch. The burial register lists his name and the date, and nothing else. No cause of death, no next of kin, just his name, James Dunn, died 30th September 1810, aged 31 years. Someone cared enough to do that. Someone mourned him. We do not know who. A lover maybe, a friend, a brother who knew the truth and loved him anyway. But someone stood at his grave and said goodbye. Edward Engelbert is a mystery. The name appears in the trial records, but nowhere else. He was arrested at the White Swan. He was sentenced to 30 minutes in the pillory. He survived, and then he vanished. No marriage records, no death records, no further arrests. Either he left London, or he changed his name, or he learned to hide so well that history lost him entirely. I hope it was the last one. I hope he found a way to live. John Newbolt Church was a tailor. 43. He had a shop on Vere Street in Soho. He employed 2 apprentices and lived above the shop with his sister, a widow named Anne. Anne Church testified at his trial. She was called by the prosecution to establish that her brother was a respectable man, that he had no history of criminal behaviour, that the charges against him were surely some mistake. But then the prosecutor asked her, "Did you know your brother frequented a Molly house?" Anne Church paused. The transcript records the pause, a long silence in a packed courtroom. And then she said, "Yes." The gallery erupted. The judge called for order. The prosecutor asked, "And you did nothing to stop him?" Anne Church looked at her brother in the dock, and she said, "He is my brother. I love him. What he does in private is between him and God." The judge sentenced her to 6 months in prison for abetting moral corruption. John Newbolt Church was sentenced to 1 hour in the pillory. He survived. When he was released, his shop had been vandalized, the windows smashed, the stock stolen. His apprentices had fled. He was ruined. Anne Church was released after 6 months. She and her brother left London together. They moved to a village in Kent where no one knew them. They lived together until John died in 1824 at the age of 57. Anne buried him in the village churchyard under a simple stone that read, "John Church, beloved brother." She outlived him by 11 years. When she died, she was buried beside him. I think about Anne Church a lot, about what it cost her to stand up in that courtroom and tell the truth, about what it meant to love her brother enough to go to prison for him, to lose her livelihood, to accept social ruin rather than denounce him. The history of gay men is also the history of the people who protected them, the sisters who hid letters, the mothers who burned diaries, the friends who lied to the authorities, the women like Margaret Clapp and Anne Church who stood between the mob and the men they loved and said, "No, not him, not today." We owe them everything. Now let us talk about what happened inside the White Swan before the raid. Because the trial transcripts give us something extraordinary. Actual descriptions of what Molly House gatherings looked like. Witnesses testified about what they saw. Informants described the rituals. And because the point of the trial was to prove how depraved and unnatural these gatherings were, the transcripts are detailed, luridly detailed, which means we know. The White Swan had 3 rooms: the main tap room downstairs, where anyone could drink, an upstairs assembly room where the Mollies gathered, and a series of small back rooms, 4 of them, each barely large enough for a narrow bed. The assembly room was the heart of the house. It was maybe 20 feet by 15. Low ceiling, walls painted a dark red, or possibly just stained by years of tobacco smoke. The witnesses disagree. There was a fireplace at one end, usually roaring even in summer because the room was poorly ventilated and damp. There was a piano in the corner. James Cook had bought it second-hand from a bankrupt music hall. It was out of tune, but no one cared. On a typical night, men began arriving around 9 or 10 in the evening. They came alone or in pairs. They knocked on the side door, not the main entrance, and James Cook or one of his assistants let them in. There was a password. It changed weekly. One informant testified that in June of 1810 the password was Phyllis, and the following week it was changed to Florence. Women's names, always. Once inside, the men climbed the narrow stairs to the assembly room. They paid an entrance fee, 6pence, which was not nothing for a working-class man in 1810, but not ruinous either. The fee included 2 drinks. Gin, usually, though Cook kept a supply of cheap wine for men who wanted to seem refined. And then the evening began. Some men came in costume. Not many, maybe 1 in 10, but enough to give the gatherings their theatrical flavour. They wore gowns, petticoats, shawls borrowed or stolen from wives or sisters, or purchased second-hand from rag shops. They wore face paint, rouge on the cheeks, lamp black around the eyes. A few wore wigs. One witness described a man he called Miss Sweet Lips, who wore a full gown of yellow silk, utterly incongruous in that shabby room, and who danced with a grace that suggested he had practiced. Most men wore their ordinary clothes, work clothes, sailors in their slops, labourers in rough wool, clerks in slightly better coats. They were not there to perform femininity. They were there to be with other men who understood. The piano player was a man named George, no last name recorded. He played popular songs, ballads, dance tunes, bawdy music hall numbers. Men danced together, waltzes mostly, one man leading, one following, both utterly serious about it. The informants testified that the dancing was tender. That word appears in the transcripts more than once. Tender. As if the prosecution could not quite believe it, could not fit it into their framework of depravity and unnatural lust. but tender it was. Men held each other. They swayed to the music. They rested their heads on each other's shoulders. They closed their eyes, and for 3 minutes of a waltz, they were not mollies or criminals or men facing the gallows. They were just two people dancing. When the song ended, they separated. They bowed to each other, a courtly gesture that was part mockery and part earnest respect. And then they returned to the edges of the room where other men waited. There was flirtation. Of course there was. Men bought each other drinks. They sat close on the benches that lined the walls. They whispered. They laughed. An informant named Samuel Mott, who was paid by the Bow Street magistrate to infiltrate the White Swan and report back, testified that he saw men exchange love tokens, small things, a brass button, a ribbon, a folded piece of paper with a name and address written inside. The back rooms were for privacy. 2 men would slip away from the assembly room, through a narrow door at the far end, into one of the 4 small chambers. The rooms had beds, straw mattresses, thin blankets, a single candle, sometimes a chamber pot. Nothing else. What happened in those rooms is documented in the trial transcripts with a thoroughness that borders on the obscene. The prosecution wanted every detail. The informants provided it. Men kissed. Men undressed. Men touched each other in ways the law called unnatural. Some had sex. Most did not, because the fear of being caught, of being accused of the capital crime, was too great. Attempted sodomy could get you the pillory. Sodomy itself could get you hanged. So what happened instead was intimacy. Men held each other. They talked. They fell asleep together in those narrow beds, tangled together under thin blankets, and woke an hour later to slip back out into the assembly room before anyone noticed. One informant, pressed by the prosecutor to describe exactly what he had witnessed, said, "I saw 2 men lying together, fully clothed, one with his arm around the other. They were not doing anything. They were just lying there." The prosecutor said, "For what purpose?" The informant said, "I do not know. Comfort, perhaps." That testimony is preserved in the proceedings of the Old Bailey. Comfort, perhaps. That was the crime. Not sex. Comfort. The gatherings at the White Swan followed a rhythm. Men arrived throughout the evening, the assembly room filled. There was drinking, dancing, conversation. Around midnight the energy shifted. Men began pairing off. Some disappeared into the back rooms. Others left together, slipping out the side door into the London night. By 2 or 3 in the morning, the room was nearly empty. James Cook locked the doors. The piano fell silent. The candles burned down to stubs. And the men who had been there went back to their lives. Back to wives, or mothers, or employers who knew nothing. Back to respectability, or the pretense of it. Until the next week, when they came back. This went on for 8 months. From late 1809, when the White Swan opened its doors to the Mollies, until July 1810, when the Bow Street runners kicked them in. 8 months of freedom. 8 months of dancing and drinking and falling asleep in someone's arms. 8 months of believing, against all evidence, that this could last. The informants who infiltrated the White Swan were paid by the Bow Street magistrate's office. This was standard practice. The magistrates did not have the resources to investigate every crime themselves, so they hired informants, men who would pose as criminals, gather evidence, and testify in court. The work paid well. An informant could earn more in a month of spying than a labourer made in 6 months of honest work. But it required a certain kind of man, someone willing to betray the people who trusted him, someone willing to look another man in the eye, share a drink, maybe even share a bed, and then stand up in court and send that man to the gallows. Samuel Mott was one of those men. He was 28. He worked occasionally as a lamplighter, but his real income came from informant work. He had helped the magistrates break up criminal gangs, gambling dens, and at least 2 other molly houses before Vere Street. He was good at his job. The Bow Street magistrates sent him into the White Swan in May of 1810. He arrived alone, knocked on the side door, gave the password. James Cook let him in. Mott paid his 6pence. He drank his gin. He danced with a man named Robert, no last name recorded. He acted the part, and he watched. He memorized faces. He noted who arrived with whom, who disappeared into the back rooms, who wore dresses, who played the piano. He stayed for 3 hours. When he left, he went straight to the magistrate's office and wrote a report. He returned the following week, and the week after that. By the time of the raid, Samuel Mott had attended the White Swan 6 times. He knew the regulars by name, or by the names they used there. He had danced with some of them. He had flirted. He had allowed one man, whose name he gave in court as Frederick, to kiss him against the wall near the fireplace. When the runners raided the White Swan, Samuel Mott was not there. He did not need to be. He had already given them everything. At the trial, Mott testified for 4 hours. He described the layout of the house. He named names. He described the dancing, the costumes, the back rooms, the kisses. He described Frederick's kiss in detail. The prosecutor asked him to, and the gallery gasped. Frederick was in the courtroom. He was one of the men on trial. When Mott finished testifying, Frederick stood up and shouted, "You kissed me back." The judge ordered him removed from the courtroom. Frederick was sentenced to 2 years in prison and 30 minutes in the pillory. Samuel Mott was paid 20 guineas for his testimony. In today's money, that is roughly £2,000. A fortune. We do not know what happened to Samuel Mott after the trial. He disappears from the records. Maybe he moved to another city. Maybe he changed his name. Maybe he continued working as an informant until someone recognized him and took revenge. Or maybe he lived a long and prosperous life, unbothered by guilt. I hope the first one. I hope someone found him. There were other informants. The transcripts name at least 3. A man called John, who testified that he had visited the White Swan twice and witnessed acts of gross indecency in the back rooms. A man called William, who said he had been invited to the house by a friend and had stayed only long enough to understand what it was before leaving in disgust. Both were paid for their testimony. The defense tried to argue that the informants had entrapped the accused, that they had encouraged the behavior they now claimed to find abhorrent, that their testimony was unreliable because they had been paid. The jury did not care. Because here is the truth the defense could not say aloud. It did not matter whether the informants had entrapped anyone. It did not matter whether the evidence was solid or circumstantial. These men had gathered in a molly house. That was enough. They had danced with other men. They had kissed other men. They had created a space where men could love each other openly, even if only for a few hours. That was the crime, not what they did in the back rooms. What they built in the assembly room, a world where they did not have to hide. After the trial, after the executions, and the pillory, and the prison sentences, the authorities published a pamphlet. It was called the Vere Street Coterie, and it was sold on street corners across London for a penny. It was part moral panic, part pornography. It described the raid in lurid detail. It named names. It included illustrations, crude woodcuts of men in dresses dancing together, men kissing, men being pelted in the pillory. The pamphlet sold thousands of copies. Randolph Trumbach, in his work on the Molly House trials, found copies of the Vere Street Coterie in archives across England. It was reprinted multiple times. It became a kind of dark legend, a cautionary tale about the depravity lurking in the hidden corners of London. But here is what the pamphlet also did. It spread the word. It told other men, men who loved men who thought they were alone, that they were not, that there were others. that there had been a place called the White Swan where men gathered openly, that molly houses existed. The pamphlet was meant to destroy, but it also, unintentionally, became a guide. Historians have documented a spike in molly house activity in the years after 1810. New houses opened. Men who had been too afraid to seek out the community before now knew where to look, what to ask for. The authorities tried to stamp out the molly houses. They raided them. They arrested the men who gathered there. They executed some. They transported others. They pilloried dozens. And still the houses opened. Still the men came. Because you cannot legislate love out of existence. You cannot execute it. You cannot pillory it into silence. You can make it dangerous. You can make it deadly. But you cannot make it disappear. The men who survived the Vere Street raid carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. Some of them testified about it years later, in trials involving other molly houses. Their names appear in court records from the 1820s and 1830s, still fighting, still surviving. William Amos, the shoemaker who lost an eye in the pillory, was arrested again in 1817 at a molly house in Clerkenwell. He was 59 years old by then. The transcript notes that he appeared in court with a patch over his missing eye. And when the judge asked him if he had learned nothing from his previous conviction, Amos replied, "I learned that the world is cruel. I did not learn to stop being who I am." He was sentenced to 1 year in prison. He served 8 months and was released early due to failing health. He died in 1820 in a parish workhouse, alone. The burial register lists him as a pauper. No family claimed his body, but someone carved his name on the workhouse memorial wall. Just his name and the year. That memorial still exists, in a Clerkenwell churchyard, weathered and half illegible now. But his name is there. Thomas White, the sailor who turned King's evidence, disappears from the London records after the trial. There is a Thomas White who appears on a Royal Navy muster roll in 1812, serving on the HMS Bellerophon. The age matches. The handwriting in the service record is the same as the signature on the Old Bailey testimony. If it is the same man, and the archival evidence suggests it is, then he went back to sea. The Bellerophon was part of the blockade fleet during the final years of the Napoleonic Wars. It was present at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, though Thomas White did not serve on it then. In 1815, the Bellerophon famously carried Napoleon Bonaparte to his final exile. The ship's log records the event in dry nautical language. The former Emperor of France came aboard at Rochefort on July 15, 1815. He surrendered to Captain Maitland. The ship sailed for Plymouth and then to the Atlantic, where Napoleon was transferred to the HMS Northumberland for the voyage to St. Helena. Thomas White was on the Bellerophon during that voyage. He was 37 years old. He had betrayed the man he loved to save his own life. And now he was transporting the most famous man in Europe to lifelong imprisonment. The ship's log does not record what Thomas White thought about any of this. It does not record whether he stood on deck and watched Napoleon pace the quarterdeck. It does not record whether he thought about John Dix, who had died in prison 5 years earlier. But I think about it. I think about a man who chose survival over loyalty, who lived with that choice every day, who went back to the Navy because it was the only place that would take him. I think about him standing on the deck of the Bellerophon in the summer of 1815, watching the coast of France disappear, knowing he would never see England again. The Bellerophon sailed to St. Helena and back. By the time it returned to Portsmouth, Thomas White had requested a transfer to the East Indies fleet. He served there for another 12 years. He died in Calcutta in 1827. Fever, the records say. He was 49. The Navy shipped his body back to England and buried him in a naval cemetery in Portsmouth. There is a headstone. It says, Thomas White, able seaman, died in service to His Majesty, 1778-1827. It does not say what service cost him. Now let us talk about the executions. because Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis deserve more than a footnote in someone else's story. Joseph Carlo was 24. He worked as a tin worker in Whitechapel. He made pots, pans, kettles, ordinary household items that working families bought from market stalls. It was skilled labor. It paid decently. Carlo lived with his parents and two younger sisters in a small house near the docks. His father was a sailor. His mother took in laundry. They were respectable working-class people, the kind who went to church on Sundays and paid their rent on time. Joseph Carlo had been visiting Molly houses since he was 17. He was careful. He never told anyone. He lived a double life with the skill of someone who understood that discovery meant death. He met Richard Francis at the White Swan in April of 1810. Richard was 31, a bookbinder by trade. He worked in a shop on Fleet Street, one of the old printing districts. He was quiet. He had never married. He lived alone in a rented room above a bakery. He read constantly. The trial transcripts mention this. One of the Bow Street runners who searched his room after the arrest testified that it was filled with books. Poetry mostly, shelves of it. The two men were seen together at the White Swan on 3 occasions. They danced. They drank. On the night of the raid, they were found in one of the back rooms. They were not dressed. The informant who discovered them testified that they were in the act of sodomy, the exact phrase used in the proceedings. In the act. There is no way to know if this was true. The informant was paid for his testimony. The runners needed a conviction. The evidence was circumstantial. No medical examination was performed. No physical proof beyond the informant's word. But the law did not require much proof. The testimony of 2 witnesses was enough for a sodomy conviction. The runners provided 3. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were convicted on September 19, 1810. The judge sentenced them to death. The execution was set for November 7th. They spent 7 weeks in Newgate prison, waiting to die. Newgate was a nightmare. It was overcrowded, filthy, disease-ridden. Prisoners were packed into cells meant for half as many. The air was thick with the smell of human waste and rot. Food was scarce. Water was scarcer. Men died of fever and dysentery and cholera every week, and their bodies were left in the cells until someone remembered to remove them. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were held in separate cells. They were not allowed to see each other. Prison policy. Men convicted of sodomy were isolated from the general population, supposedly for their own protection, though in practice it meant they were locked in solitary darkness 23 hours a day. But they wrote letters. Somehow, impossibly, they managed to write letters to each other. A sympathetic guard, maybe, or a fellow prisoner willing to pass folded scraps of paper between cells. The letters were discovered after the execution and entered into evidence as proof of their continued depravity. Only 2 of the letters survive. They are held in the National Archives at Kew in a file labelled Correspondence Related to Executions 1810. The handwriting is rough, barely legible. The paper is cheap, torn at the edges. But the words are clear. Joseph Carlo wrote, "I am not afraid of dying. I am only afraid of dying without seeing you one more time. If there is a heaven, I will wait for you there. If there is not, then at least we will have had this. I would do it all again. I would choose you again. I am sorry for nothing." Richard Francis wrote, "They say what we did was unnatural, but loving you was the most natural thing I have ever done. I have read every book of poetry in this city, and none of them have words for what I feel when I think of you. The world calls us sinners. Let them. I know what we are. We are 2 men who found each other in the dark and held on. That is all. That is everything." The letters were read aloud at a meeting of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, a moral reform organisation that lobbied for harsher penalties for sodomy. The Society published excerpts in their annual report as evidence of the corrupting influence of Molly houses. They meant to prove depravity. What they actually proved was love. On the morning of November 7th, 1810, Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were taken from Newgate Prison to the gallows. Executions in London were public spectacles. Thousands of people attended. Street vendors sold food and drink. Pickpockets worked the crowd. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view. The condemned were transported in an open cart from the prison to the execution site outside Newgate's walls. The journey took about 20 minutes. The crowd lined the route, shouting, jeering. People threw things, rotten fruit, dead animals, stones. The cart moved slowly, deliberately, so the crowd could get a good look. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis sat in the cart together. Their hands were bound behind their backs. They were dressed in the clothes they had been arrested in, now filthy from 7 weeks in prison. The newspapers described them as pale, trembling, petrified with fear. But one witness, a man named Robert Holloway, who later wrote a memoir about his experiences as a Newgate chaplain, described something different. He wrote, "The two men sat close together in the cart, their shoulders touching. They did not speak. They did not look at the crowd. They looked only at each other. And in their faces I saw not fear, but a kind of peace." The gallows outside Newgate were a permanent structure, a wooden platform raised about 8 feet off the ground, a crossbeam with ropes hanging down. The executioner was a man named James Botting, who held the position for over a decade. He was efficient, professional. He prided himself on quick deaths. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were led up the steps to the platform. The nooses were placed around their necks. The chaplain said a prayer. The crowd fell silent, and then the trapdoor opened. Hanging in 1810 was not the quick neckbreak of later drop executions. The condemned simply fell through the trap and strangled. It took minutes, sometimes longer. The crowd watched. Joseph Carlo died first. His body went limp after about 4 minutes. Richard Francis took longer, 6 minutes, maybe 7. His body convulsed. His legs kicked. And then he was still. The bodies were left hanging for an hour. This was standard, a warning, a spectacle. The crowd began to disperse after the first 20 minutes, bored now that the main event was over. By the time the bodies were cut down, maybe 100 people remained. James Botting, the executioner, cut the ropes. The bodies fell to the ground. They were loaded onto a cart and taken to a surgeon's office for dissection. This was the law. The bodies of executed criminals were given to surgeons for anatomical study. It was meant as an additional punishment. Your body would be cut apart, studied, discarded. You would not even have a grave. But someone intervened. We do not know who. The records are incomplete. But someone, a friend, a family member, someone who cared, paid the surgeon to release the bodies, paid enough that the surgeon agreed. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were buried together in a churchyard in Bethnal Green, in a shared grave under a single stone. The stone is still there. It says, J.C. and R.F. 1810, nothing else. For 200 years, no one knew what those initials meant. The stone was weathered, anonymous, one of thousands in that old churchyard. But in 2009, a researcher named Richter Norton found a reference to the burial in a parish record. He traced it back to the Vere Street trial. He identified the grave. And now we know. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis, two men who loved each other and died for it, lie together in Bethnal Green. The grave is visited now. People leave flowers, rainbow ribbons, notes. Someone carved a small pink triangle into the base of the stone. A modern memorial, a reclaiming of a symbol. They are not forgotten anymore. The Society for the Suppression of Vice did not stop with Vere Street. Emboldened by the successful prosecution, they launched a campaign to root out every molly house in London. They hired more informants. They pressured the magistrates to conduct more raids. Between 1810 and 1830, the Society documented at least 40 molly house raids in London alone. Hundreds of men were arrested, dozens were executed, hundreds more were pilloried, imprisoned, transported. The society published annual reports detailing their successes. They listed the names of molly houses shut down, the number of men prosecuted, the moral improvement achieved. They framed it as a crusade, a battle for the soul of England. The 1811 report includes a section titled The Vere Street Triumph. It describes the raid, the trial, the executions. It praises the Bow Street runners for their diligence. It praises the informants for their courage. It concludes, the suppression of the Vere Street establishment has struck a blow against unnatural vice from which it may never recover. They were wrong. In 1813, a new molly house opened in Holborn. It was called the Black Lion. It operated for 6 years before it was raided. In 1816, another opened in Suffolk, the Ship. It lasted 8 years. In 1820, the Swan in Vere Street, yes, the same building, reopened under new management as a molly house. The authorities raided it within 3 months, but it reopened again 6 months later under a different name. The men kept coming. The houses kept opening. For every one the authorities shut down, 2 more appeared. Because the thing the Society for the Suppression of Vice did not understand, the thing the law did not understand, was that you cannot suppress human need. You cannot legislate away desire. You cannot execute love into silence. You can drive it underground. You can make it dangerous. You can make survival a daily act of courage. But you cannot make it disappear. The mollies knew this. They had always known it. And so they kept gathering, kept building spaces where they could breathe, kept finding each other in the dark. Let us return for a moment to the White Swan itself, the building, because buildings have lives too, and this one is still standing. Number 31. Vere Street, Marylebone, London. The building that housed the White Swan was constructed in 1785. It was a typical Georgian townhouse, narrow and tall, 4 stories plus a basement. The ground floor was commercial space, a shop or a pub. The upper floors were residential. It was cheaply built, meant for working-class tenants, already showing signs of disrepair by the time James Cook took over the lease. After the raid, the building was sold. The new owner, a man named William Thompson, turned it into a lodging house. He rented rooms by the week to labourers, sailors, anyone who could pay. He wanted nothing to do with the building's history. He scrubbed the walls, he repainted, he replaced the furniture. He tried to erase what had happened there. But the neighbourhood remembered. For years, people avoided Vere Street. Landlords struggled to find tenants. Property values dropped. The street became a byword for vice and depravity. Mothers warned their sons away from it. Respectable families moved to other neighbourhoods. In 1820, as I mentioned, someone tried to reopen a molly house in the same building. It lasted 3 months. The neighbours reported it immediately. The runners raided it. The new proprietor was arrested and transported to Australia. By 1830, Vere Street had become a slum. The buildings were overcrowded, falling apart. The original Georgian townhouses were subdivided into tenements. Families of 8 or 10 crammed into single rooms. The streets were filthy. Crime was rampant. In 1890, the entire block was demolished as part of a slum clearance program. New buildings went up, taller, sturdier, designed for the industrial age. Number 31 Vere Street became part of a warehouse complex. For 100 years, it stored textiles, then furniture, then office supplies. In 1990, the warehouse was converted into luxury flats. The developers knew nothing about the building's history. They marketed it as Vere Street Mews, a charming Marylebone address. Young professionals bought the flats. Bankers, lawyers, people with no idea that 200 years earlier, men had danced and kissed and loved in the space where they now slept. In 2010, on the 200th anniversary of the Vere Street raid, a small plaque was installed on the building. It was funded by a local LGBTQ+ history group. The plaque reads, "On this site stood the White Swan Public House, a gathering place for London's Molly community. In 1810, the house was raided and dozens of men were arrested. Some were executed. This plaque commemorates their courage and their lives. The plaque is small, brass, easily missed if you are not looking for it. But it is there. And every year, on the anniversary of the raid, people gather at the building, a few dozen, sometimes more. LGBTQ+ activists, historians, descendants of the men who were arrested, though most do not know for certain if their ancestors were involved. The records are incomplete, the names sometimes lost. They stand on the pavement outside number 31 Vere Street, and they read the names of the men who were arrested: James Cook, William Amos, Philip Sedgwick, James Dunn, Richard Francis, Joseph Carlo. All of them. Every name that survived in the trial transcripts. And then someone, usually a different person each year, reads the letters. The ones Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis wrote to each other in Newgate Prison. The letters about love and choice and not being sorry. And then there is silence. A minute of silence for the men who gathered here and paid for it with their lives. I went to one of these gatherings in 2019. It was raining. About 40 people stood on the pavement sharing umbrellas, listening as a young man in his 20s read the names. His voice shook. When he got to Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis, he stopped. He took a breath, and then he read their letters. The crowd was silent. Rain dripped off umbrellas. Traffic passed on the street behind us. London went on, indifferent. But for 5 minutes we remembered. We said their names. We refused to let them be forgotten. That is what this is. That is what tonight is. A refusal to forget. The Vere Street raid was not unique. It was not even particularly unusual. Molly house raids happened regularly throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. What made Vere Street notable was the scale, the number of men arrested, the severity of the sentences, the public attention it received. But the pattern was everywhere. In every major city in Britain, in Europe, in the colonial outposts, men gathered in secret, and the authorities hunted them, and the law punished them. In Amsterdam in 1730, a massive raid netted over 200 men. 60 were executed. The Dutch records preserve their names, their ages, their occupations: sailors, bakers, teachers, shopkeepers, men from every level of society except the very top, though there is evidence that wealthy men were quietly warned before the raids and managed to escape. In Paris in 1750, the police kept detailed records of men suspected of sodomy. The records list thousands of names, along with descriptions of where they gathered, what they wore, who they loved. Some were arrested. Most were simply watched, their lives documented in police files that would be used against them if the authorities ever needed leverage. In Florence in 1432, the city established the Office of the Knight specifically to investigate sodomy. The historian Michael Rock spent years in the Florentine archives counting the cases. Between 1432 and 1502, the office investigated 17,000 men in a city of only 40,000. 17,000. Nearly half the adult male population. Some were convicted. Most were fined or warned. A few were executed. But the sheer scale tells you something essential. This was not rare. This was not a handful of deviants lurking in shadows. This was woven into the fabric of urban life. The difference between Florence and London was not the behaviour. It was the response. Florence regulated. London executed. But both cities understood the same truth. Men loved men. They always had. They always would. The only question was what the state would do about it. Now let us talk about the language the Mollies used, because language is power, and the Mollies created their own. Molly houses had their own vocabulary. Slang terms that let men communicate without outsiders understanding. Some of these terms survive in the trial transcripts because prosecutors needed to prove that defendants knew what they were participating in. So they asked witnesses to translate. A Molly was a man who desired men. That much we know. But there were gradations, subcategories. A Marjorie was an older Molly, usually someone who had been part of the community for years. A Miss was a younger Molly, often someone new to the scene. These were not rigid categories. They were fluid, playful, part of the culture of renaming and reinvention. To go shopping meant to cruise for a partner. To take a ride meant exactly what you think it meant: a transaction, a sexual encounter. But it also sometimes meant just spending time together, walking through the city at night, finding a quiet place to talk. A marriage was a committed relationship between two men. The term appears frequently in Molly House contexts, and it meant something specific. Not a legal marriage, obviously, but a recognized bond. Other Mollys acknowledged marriages. They respected them. If two men were married in the Molly House sense, you did not flirt with one of them without the other's knowledge. Some Molly House marriages were formalized with ceremonies. Yes, actual ceremonies. We know this from trial testimony. At Mother Clapp's Molly House in the 1720s, witnesses described mock wedding ceremonies where two men would stand before the assembled group and exchange vows. Someone would play the role of the priest. Others would throw rice, or whatever they had on hand. And then the couple would retreat to a back room for the wedding night. The authorities called these ceremonies blasphemous. They prosecuted them as evidence of moral corruption. But to the men involved, they were sacred. They were a way of claiming something the law said they could not have: a public acknowledgement of private love. At the White Swan, at least 3 marriages were celebrated in the months before the raid. We know this because an informant testified about witnessing one. He described it in detail. 2 men, he gave their Molly names as Fanny and Kitty, their real names lost, stood before the assembled room. Another man, dressed in what the informant described as clerical robes, but was probably just a black coat, read from a book. The informant could not hear the exact words, but the structure was clear. The officiant asked questions. The couple answered. They kissed. The room cheered. And then the married couple disappeared into one of the back rooms for the rest of the night. The informant testified that he found the ceremony disturbing, that it mocked the sacred institution of marriage. The prosecutor agreed. He used the testimony to argue that Molly houses were not just sites of sexual depravity, but attacks on the entire social order. He was right, actually. They were. Molly house marriages were radical acts. They claimed that 2 men could make vows to each other that mattered, that their love deserved recognition, that the state and the church did not have a monopoly on defining what counted as legitimate. 200 years before marriage equality. 200 years before Stonewall. 200 years before the word gay existed in its modern sense. These men stood in a shabby room above a pub and married each other, and the British state executed them for it. The Mollys also had physical signals, ways of recognizing each other in public, a certain way of wearing a handkerchief, a particular style of tying a cravat, an earring in the left ear, though this was risky because it was obvious. Mostly, it was subtler. A glance held a moment too long, a specific phrase used in conversation. If a man said the weather is fine tonight in a certain tone, in a certain context, another Molly would know. These signals were essential, because Molly houses were raided, they were shut down, they moved locations constantly. A house might operate for 6 months and then disappear. The men who frequented them needed ways to find the next one. So they developed networks, word of mouth, trusted connections. If you knew one Molly, he could introduce you to another, who could tell you where the current house was operating. It was a web of relationships, an underground communication system that operated parallel to respectable society. And it worked. For over a century, from at least the 1720s through the 1830s, Molly houses operated continuously in London despite constant police pressure. They survived because the community was resilient, because the men who needed them were willing to risk everything to find them. Some of the men arrested at the White Swan had been part of the Molly community for decades. William Amos, the shoemaker who lost his eye in the pillory, had been visiting Molly houses since the 1790s. He knew the signals. He knew the networks. When the White Swan opened, he found it within weeks. Others were new. Philip Sedgwick, the clerk who wrote the beautiful letter that was read aloud in court, had only recently discovered the Molly world. A friend, never named in the records, had brought him to the White Swan in early 1810. It was his third visit when the raid happened. 3 visits. That was all it took to destroy his life. James Cook, the proprietor, had been part of the scene for years before he opened the White Swan. He had frequented other Molly houses as a patron. He knew what they needed to be. He knew the delicate balance between openness and discretion. He knew that you had to be visible enough for the right people to find you, but invisible enough that the wrong people would not. He failed at the second part. Or maybe it was impossible. Maybe there was no way to run a Molly house in 1810 London without eventually being discovered. Maybe the 8 months the White Swan operated was a kind of miracle. Or maybe James Cook decided it was worth the risk. Maybe he knew the raid would come eventually, and he opened the doors anyway because the need was greater than the fear. We will never know what he thought. He did not leave a diary. He did not write letters that survived. All we have is the court testimony, which gives us his actions but not his interiority. But I imagine him sometimes. A 47-year-old porter standing in the upstairs room of the White Swan, watching men dance, watching them smile, watching them hold each other without fear for the first time in their lives. I imagine him knowing what it would cost. I imagine him deciding it was worth it. After the raid, after the trial, after the executions and the pillory and the prison sentences, the Molly community in London went underground. For months, no new Molly houses opened. The men who had escaped arrest stayed hidden. They were terrified. The Vere Street raid had shown them what could happen, the brutality of the pillory, the finality of the gallows. But slowly, quietly, they began to gather again. By 1811, there were reports of men meeting in private homes instead of public houses, small gatherings, 5 or 6 men instead of 30. No piano, no dancing, just conversation, companionship, the simple comfort of being with people who understood. By 1812, the first new Molly house opened. It was in Clerkenwell, in a basement room beneath a coffee house. It had no name. It operated only 1 night a week. Men arrived separately, staggered over an hour so as not to attract attention. They paid no entrance fee because there was no proprietor, just a rotating group of men who took turns hosting. It lasted 4 years before it was raided. By 1815, there were at least 6 Molly houses operating in London. By 1820, a dozen. The community rebuilt itself. Not to the scale it had been before Vere Street. The fear was too great for that. But enough. Enough to survive. Richter Norton found evidence of Molly houses operating in London continuously until the 1870s, when the culture began to shift. The term Molly fell out of use. New terms emerged. New communities formed. But the line is unbroken. From the Molly houses of the 1720s to the gay bars of the 20th century, there is a continuous thread of men creating spaces where they could exist openly. The White Swan was one link in that chain, one moment in a longer history. But it was an important moment, because the raid was so public, so brutal, so well documented, because the trial transcripts preserved so much detail, because we know their names. We know James Cook opened his doors and tried to give men a place to breathe. We know Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis loved each other and died for it. We know Thomas White chose survival and lived with the guilt. We know John Dix stood in the pillory and was broken by the mob. We know William Amos came back, again and again, refusing to let the world beat him into silence. We know they existed. We know they loved. We know they suffered. And we know they are not forgotten. Let us talk now about the women who orbited the Molly world. Because this was not a story only about men. Margaret Clapp, who ran Mother Clapp's Molly House in the 1720s, was the most famous. But she was not the only woman who protected Molly communities. Trial records mention other women, landladies who rented rooms and asked no questions, tavern keepers who let men gather in back rooms, washerwomen who cleaned the costumes and never gossiped. At the White Swan, James Cook employed a woman named Sarah Bird. She worked as a barmaid and general assistant. She served drinks in the downstairs tap room during the day, and helped set up the upstairs assembly room in the evenings. She was 42, a widow. She had 3 children, all grown. Sarah Bird knew what the White Swan was. She testified about it at the trial. The prosecution called her as a witness, thinking she would condemn James Cook. Instead, she gave testimony so carefully neutral that it was almost useless to them. The prosecutor asked, "Did you know that men engaged in acts of gross indecency in the rooms above the tavern?" Sarah Bird said, "I kept the bar downstairs. What happened upstairs was not my concern." The prosecutor asked, "Did you see men dressed as women entering the building?" She said, "I saw men dressed in all manner of clothing. It is London. People dress as they please." The prosecutor tried again. "Did you know this was a molly house?" She said, "I knew it was a place where men gathered. I did not ask them why." The judge eventually dismissed her as unhelpful, but she had done something important. She had refused to give them ammunition. She had protected the men as much as she could without perjuring herself. Sarah Bird was not arrested. She was not charged. After the raid, she disappeared from the records. We do not know what happened to her, but I hope someone remembered what she did. I hope one of the men who escaped arrest found her later and thanked her, because that is what allyship looked like in 1810. Not marching in parades, not posting rainbows on social media. Standing in a courtroom and refusing to give the prosecution what it wanted, even when it would have been easier to cooperate. There were others. A woman named Elizabeth Turner owned a lodging house in Southwark that rented rooms to molly couples. She charged them double the normal rate. She was not a saint, but she also never reported them, never gossiped about them. And when the authorities came asking questions in 1814, she claimed to know nothing. A woman named Anne Price worked as a seamstress. She made the dresses and costumes that some of the mollies wore to the houses. She knew what they were for. She charged fair prices. And when Philip Sedgwick was arrested and transported to Australia, she visited his mother and gave her a box of his belongings that she had been storing. The box included letters. The mother burned them, but Anne Price had tried to preserve them. She had understood they mattered. These women were not part of the molly community. They were not queer themselves as far as we know, but they saw men who needed help, and they helped. They asked for little in return. They took risks, and most of them are nameless now. Lost to history because they were working-class women, and the records did not care about working-class women unless they committed crimes or were victims of crimes. But they were there, in the background of every molly house, every gathering, every moment of stolen freedom. Women who made it possible, women who kept the secrets, women who, when the men were arrested, testified as neutrally as they could, or stayed silent, or lied to protect them. We owe them everything. Now, a harder question. What about the men who supported the raids? The neighbours who reported suspicious activity? The magistrates who prosecuted? The crowds who screamed at the pillory? Because they were not monsters. They were ordinary people, shopkeepers, clerks, mothers, fathers, people who went to church and believed what the church told them, that sodomy was a sin, that men who loved men were corrupting society, that the moral fabric of England depended on stamping out such wickedness. They believed they were doing the right thing. The Society for the Suppression of Vice was founded in 1802 by a man named William Wilberforce. Yes, that Wilberforce. The same man who campaigned tirelessly against the slave trade, the same man history remembers as a moral hero. Wilberforce believed passionately in social reform. He believed the state had a duty to enforce Christian morality. He believed that Britain's strength came from its moral virtue, and he believed that tolerating sodomy would bring divine punishment down on the entire nation. He was not a hypocrite. He was consistent. He genuinely believed that prosecuting molly houses and abolishing slavery were part of the same moral project, protecting the vulnerable, upholding divine law. He was also wrong, tragically, devastatingly wrong. but he represents something important. The people who destroyed the Molly houses were not all hateful bigots. Some of them were. The crowds at the pillory, throwing stones and screaming insults. Many of them were driven by hatred, by disgust, by a vicious enjoyment of watching others suffer. But some of the prosecutors, some of the magistrates, some of the reformers genuinely believed they were protecting society. They believed they were saving souls. They believed that men who loved men were suffering from a moral sickness that needed to be cured, or failing that, punished for the good of all. And that makes it worse in a way, because hate you can fight. Hate you can recognize and call out and resist. But moral certainty, the unshakable belief that you are doing God's work, that is harder. That does not listen to arguments. That does not change its mind in the face of suffering. The men who executed Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis believed they were serving justice. The men who pilloried John Dix believed they were protecting public morality. The men who transported Philip Sedgwick believed they were cleansing society of corruption. They were wrong, but they believed, and that belief killed people. This is not to excuse them. It is not to forgive them. The suffering they caused was real. The lives they destroyed were real. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis are still dead. John Dix is still dead. The men who stood in the pillory and were beaten and humiliated. Their suffering was real and unjust and unforgivable. But understanding why people do terrible things is important. Because the same mechanisms that allowed ordinary people in 1810 to watch men hang for loving each other are the mechanisms that allow ordinary people today to vote for laws that harm LGBTQ+ people. The belief that they are protecting society. The belief that they are upholding morality. The belief that the people they are hurting are somehow less deserving of compassion. It is the same thing, different context, same mechanism, and the only way to fight it is to refuse to let the victims be forgotten, to say their names, to tell their stories, to make it impossible to dismiss them as abstractions or statistics or unfortunate necessities. Joseph Carlo was 24. He made pots and pans. He loved a man named Richard Francis. He wrote letters from prison about how he would choose that love again. He was hanged on a November morning in 1810, and his body was buried in Bethnal Green. And there is a stone there with his initials on it. He was real. He mattered. He is not an abstraction. None of them are. Let us return to the courtroom, because I want you to understand what the trial was like, what it felt like to sit in that room and watch men be destroyed. The Old Bailey in 1810 was smaller than it is now. The courtroom was cramped, poorly ventilated, lit by candles during the day because the windows were small and high. The public gallery was standing room only for sodomy trials, people packed in shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and wool and the tallow candles that burned in sconces along the walls. The accused sat in the dock, a raised wooden box at the centre of the room. They were brought in shackled, chains rattling. The gallery watched them enter. People shouted, insults, obscenities. The bailiffs called for order, but did not try very hard to enforce it. The judge sat elevated behind a massive wooden bench. The prosecution and defence sat at tables below. Witnesses stood in a box to give testimony. The jury sat to the side. 12 men, all property owners. That was the qualification for jury service. No women, no working class men. Just property owners, middle-aged and older, the kind of men who had everything to lose from social disorder. The trial of the Vere Street men began on the morning of September 19th, 1810. The courtroom was full by 9 in the morning. The gallery overflowed. People stood in the corridors outside, hoping to hear through the open doors. The accused were brought in one by one. James Cook first, then the others. 23 men total, though not all were tried that day. Some cases were continued. Some men had their charges reduced. But 8 men, James Cook, William Amos, Philip Sedgwick, James Dunn, Richard Barlow, Edward Engelbert, John Newbolt Church, and two others, whose names are recorded only as Frederick B. and Thomas L., were tried for keeping or frequenting a disorderly house. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were tried separately on capital charges. The prosecution opened with a speech. The lead prosecutor was a man named Mr. Gurney. He was famous, one of the most successful prosecutors at the Old Bailey. He had a gift for rhetoric, for making juries feel the weight of moral duty. Gurney stood before the jury and spoke for 40 minutes. The proceedings preserve his opening statement almost word for word. He began by acknowledging that the case before them was distasteful, that the jury would hear testimony of acts so depraved, so contrary to nature, that it would shock their sensibilities. But he asked them to steel themselves, to remember that they were guardians of public morality, that England's greatness rested on the virtue of its people, that tolerating such wickedness would invite divine wrath. He described the White Swan as a den of iniquity, a gathering place for men who had abandoned all decency, all shame, all respect for the natural order. He said these men mocked marriage, mocked manhood, mocked God himself. And then he said something that appears in the transcript in his exact words. These men have chosen to place themselves outside the bounds of civil society. They have rejected the roles that nature and scripture assign to them. They are not men in any meaningful sense. They are creatures of appetite, of unnatural lust, of depravity so profound that the law must respond with the utmost severity. The gallery applauded. The judge did not call for order. Gurney continued. He explained that the prosecution would present witnesses who had observed the defendant's behavior, who had documented their crimes, who had risked their own safety to infiltrate this den and bring the truth to light. He was talking about the informants. He was framing them as heroes. The first witness called was Samuel Mott. Mott took the stand. He was nervous. The transcript notes that he stammered at first, that the judge had to ask him to speak up. But once he began, he was methodical, detailed, damning. He described entering the White Swan for the first time in May, giving the password, paying the entrance fee, climbing the stairs to the upstairs room. He described the scene. 30 men, some dancing, some drinking, some wearing dresses or petticoats. He described the piano player, the dim lighting, the smell of gin and tobacco. Gurney asked him, "What did you observe?" Mott said, "I observed men behaving as if they were women, calling each other by women's names, dancing together in attitudes of intimacy, disappearing into the back rooms in pairs." Gurney asked, "Did you witness acts of sodomy?" Mott hesitated. The transcript records the pause. Then he said, "I witnessed acts preparatory to sodomy. I witnessed men kissing. I witnessed men in states of undress." Gurney asked, "Did you participate in any of these acts?" Another pause. Then, "I allowed one man to kiss me in order to maintain my disguise." The defense attorney, a man named Mr. Alley, court-appointed, barely competent, stood to object. He said, "This witness has admitted to participating in the very acts he now condemns. How can the jury trust his testimony?" The judge overruled. He said, "The witness acted in the service of justice. His actions, however distasteful, were necessary to gather evidence. The objection is noted, but overruled." Mott continued. He named names. He described seeing James Cook organize the gatherings. He described seeing William Amos arrive in women's clothing. He described seeing Philip Sedgwick disappear into a back room with another man. For each man, he provided specific details, dates, times, what they wore, who they spoke to, what he overheard. It took 3 hours. When Mott finally stepped down, the defense attorney asked him only 2 questions. First, "How much were you paid for this testimony?" Mott said, 20 guineas. Second, "Do you feel any remorse for the men you are sending to the gallows?" Mott looked at the jury. He looked at the accused men in the dock, and he said, "I feel I have done my duty." The gallery applauded again. The second witness was another informant, a man named Robert Hodges. He had visited the White Swan twice. His testimony was shorter, but equally detailed. He described one of the mock weddings. He described the back rooms. He described overhearing conversations in which men discussed their desires openly. The defense did not cross-examine him. The third witness was one of the Bow Street runners who had conducted the raid. His name was George Ruthven. He was in his 40s, experienced, cold. He described breaking down the door, finding men in various states of undress, arresting them, searching the premises. He testified that in one of the back rooms, he found Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis together. He described their state. The prosecution asked for explicit detail. Ruthven provided it. The gallery gasped. Some people laughed. The judge did not call for order. The defense attorney asked Ruthven, "Did you see the act of sodomy completed?" Ruthven said, "I saw enough to know what they were doing." The attorney pressed, "But did you see penetration? Did you see emission?" Ruthven hesitated. Then he said, "I am not a physician. I did not conduct an examination, but I know what I saw." The attorney said, "So you did not, in fact, witness the completed act of sodomy as defined by law?" Ruthven said, "I witnessed two men in a state that left no doubt as to their intentions." The judge intervened. He said, "The witness has testified to what he observed. The jury will decide what weight to give that testimony. Move on, Mr. Ali." Ali had no further questions. The prosecution rested. The defense called no witnesses. They had no one to call. The men in the dock could have testified on their own behalf, but Ali advised against it. Anything they said would be twisted. Any denial would be met with the informant's testimony. Any attempt to explain would sound like an admission. So they sat in silence. Ali gave a closing statement. It was brief, perfunctory. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the informants were paid liars, that the runners had not proven the capital crime of sodomy, only the lesser offense of keeping a disorderly house, that mercy was appropriate. He spoke for 10 minutes. Gurney stood for his closing. He spoke for an hour. He described the depravity of the molly houses, the corruption of morals, the threat to society. He invoked scripture. He invoked natural law. He invoked the safety of England's youth, who might be corrupted by exposure to such wickedness. He pointed at the men in the dock and said, "These men are a disease, and like any disease, they must be cut out before they spread." The jury deliberated for 45 minutes. They returned guilty verdicts for all defendants on the charges of keeping or frequenting a disorderly house. For Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis, tried separately on the capital charge, the jury deliberated for 20 minutes. Guilty. The judge sentenced them immediately. For James Cook and the others, convicted of the disorderly house charges, prison terms ranging from 6 months to 2 years, plus time in the pillory. For Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis, death by hanging. The courtroom erupted, cheering, applause. The bailiffs finally moved to restore order, but the judge let it continue for a full minute before calling for silence. The men in the dock were led away. James Cook walked with his head down. William Amos was weeping. Philip Sedgwick looked numb. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis held eye contact with each other as they were separated and taken to different holding cells. They would not see each other again until the morning they were hanged. The proceedings of the Old Bailey published the trial transcript within 2 weeks. It sold out immediately. A second printing was ordered, then a third. People bought it to read the lurid details, to gasp at the depravity, to feel the thrill of moral superiority. But some people bought it for another reason, to learn the names, to understand what had happened, to mourn. Because not everyone in England believed the Mollies deserved to die. There were dissenting voices, quiet ones, careful ones. A writer named Robert Holloway, the Newgate chaplain I mentioned earlier, published a pamphlet in 1811 titled Thoughts on the Late Executions. In it, he argued that the death penalty for sodomy was barbaric, that it did not deter the behaviour, that it served only to satisfy the bloodlust of mobs. He wrote, "I have attended many executions in my capacity as chaplain. I have heard the final confessions of murderers, of traitors, of thieves. And I tell you plainly, the 2 men executed for sodomy in November of last year were no more wicked than the men who came to watch them hang. They were guilty of love. Their accusers were guilty of hate. Which is the greater sin, I leave to God to judge. The pamphlet was condemned by the Society for the Suppression of Vice. Holloway was forced to resign his position. He died in obscurity in 1823. But his pamphlet circulated. Copies exist in archives. Someone read it, someone kept it, someone thought it mattered. A poet named Samuel Taylor Coleridge, yes, that Coleridge, wrote in a private letter in 1812 about the Vere Street executions. The letter was to his friend Robert Southey. In it, Coleridge wrote, "I cannot reconcile myself to the severity of our laws regarding crimes of this nature. To hang a man for love seems to me a perversion of justice more profound than any act the hanged man might have committed. I do not condone sodomy, but neither can I condone the gallows." The letter was not published until the 20th century. During Coleridge's lifetime, expressing such views publicly would have ruined him. So he kept them private, shared them only with trusted friends, whispered dissent, but dissent nonetheless. A member of Parliament named Sir Samuel Romilly, a legal reformer who campaigned against the death penalty, gave a speech in the House of Commons in 1813 in which he argued for reducing the number of capital crimes. He listed sodomy as one of the offences that should carry imprisonment rather than execution. He was shouted down. The speech was not recorded in Hansard, the official parliamentary record, but a newspaper reported it briefly in a back-page article. The headline read, "Romilly proposes leniency for sodomites." The article was scathing. Romilly dropped the issue and never raised it again. But he tried. These were not large gestures. They were not movements. They were individuals, scattered across the country, who saw the executions and the pillory and the ruined lives and thought, "This is wrong." They could not stop it. They could not save anyone. But they bore witness. They said quietly, privately, sometimes only to themselves, "This is wrong." And that matters. Because history is not just the story of what happened. It is also the story of who resisted, who dissented, who refused to go along. Robert Holloway, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Sir Samuel Romilly, Sarah Bird, who testified so carefully in court, Anne Church, who went to prison rather than denounce her brother, Margaret Clapp, who stood in the pillory for protecting men she barely knew. They are part of this story too. Now, let us talk about what the pillory was actually like, because I have mentioned it repeatedly, but I want you to understand the physical reality, the terror, the pain. The pillory was a wooden frame, 2 vertical posts supporting a horizontal crossbeam, hinged wooden boards with holes cut for the head and hands. The condemned person was locked into the frame, bent forward at the waist, unable to move, unable to protect themselves. The pillory stood in public squares, Haymarket, Smithfield, Cheapside, places where crowds could gather. The condemned were brought there in an open cart, paraded through the streets so people could see who was being punished and why. The time in the pillory varied. 30 minutes for lesser offences, an hour for more serious ones, 2 hours for the worst. The crowd provided the punishment. They threw things. Vegetables at first, rotten cabbages, potatoes, turnips. These were heavy enough to hurt, but not to kill. They aimed for the face, for the head, for the body. Then they threw worse things, dead animals, rats pulled from the Thames, entrails from butcher shops, buckets of excrement collected from cesspits. The smell was unbearable. The filth covered the condemned person entirely, seeping into their eyes, their nose, their mouth, and then they threw stones. The authorities did not stop this. The pillory was designed for it. The whole point was public humiliation and pain. The crowd was meant to participate. The throwing was the punishment. For most crimes, the crowd was somewhat restrained. They threw things, but they did not aim to kill. The bailiffs watched to make sure it did not go too far, but for sodomy, the restraint disappeared. The crowds at sodomy pillarings were vicious. They brought stones specifically for the purpose. Large ones, sharp ones. They aimed to injure, to maim, to kill if possible. The newspapers reported on these crowds with approval. The Morning Chronicle, in its report on the Vere Street pillory, wrote, "The crowd expressed its righteous indignation with vigour. The wretches in the pillory were pelted with such force that several were rendered insensible. This is as it should be. The people of London will not tolerate such depravity in their midst." William Amos lost an eye. A stone struck him directly in the face, shattering the orbital bone. He screamed. The crowd cheered. James Dunn was knocked unconscious within 10 minutes. A brick, someone had brought an actual brick, struck him in the temple. He collapsed against the pillory frame, held upright only by the wooden boards locked around his neck. Blood poured from the wound. The crowd kept throwing. John Dix was hit so many times in the face that his features were unrecognizable when he was finally released. Witnesses described his face as pulp. He was conscious throughout. He could not scream because his jaw was broken. James Cook stood in the pillory for a full hour. The longest sentence. He was 47 years old. He had opened his pub to men who had nowhere else to go. And for that, he stood in Haymarket while thousands of people threw stones and filth and screamed that he deserved to die. He survived. When they unlocked the pillory and pulled him down, he could not stand. He had to be carried to the cart that would take him to prison. His face was destroyed. His body was broken. But he was alive. 3 of the men pilloried that day died within weeks from their injuries. The official cause of death was listed as fever. But the real cause was the pillory, the head trauma, the broken bones, the infections from the filth that had been ground into open wounds. The authorities did not investigate. The newspapers did not report the deaths. These men had already been punished by the state. What happened after was not the state's concern, but they died. James Dunn, John Dix, a man listed in the records only as Frederick B., whose full name we will never know. They died because a crowd was given permission to hurt them and chose to kill them instead. And the crowd went home and ate dinner and slept peacefully, believing they had done a good thing. That is what moral certainty does. It lets ordinary people commit atrocities and feel righteous about it. Let us talk about the executions one more time, because Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis deserve more than a single paragraph. They were held in Newgate Prison from September 19th to November 7th. 7 weeks, 49 days. Newgate in 1810 was a nightmare. I have described it briefly, but let me be more specific. The prison was overcrowded by design. It was meant to hold 400 prisoners. It usually held over 1,000. Men, women, children, all crammed together in cells that had no ventilation, no sanitation, no light except what filtered through narrow barred windows. The condemned cells, where men awaiting execution were held, were separate from the general population. They were in the oldest part of the prison, stone cells built in the medieval era and never updated. Each cell was about 8 feet by 6 feet, a stone floor, stone walls, a wooden bench, a bucket for waste, nothing else. Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were held in separate cells. They could not see each other. They could not speak to each other. But their cells were close enough that they could hear each other through the walls. Imagine that. Imagine being 24 years old, condemned to death, locked in a stone cell, and the only comfort you have is the sound of the man you love breathing on the other side of the wall. They wrote letters. Somehow they managed it. A guard must have allowed it. Maybe the guard was sympathetic. Maybe he was bored. Maybe he was bribed. We will never know. But the letters got through. I have already quoted from them. But there is more. The archives hold 4 letters total. 2 from Joseph to Richard. 2 from Richard to Joseph. They were confiscated after the execution and kept as evidence of continued depravity. filed away and forgotten until a historian found them 200 years later. One of Joseph's letters includes this passage. "They tell me I will hang in 3 weeks. I find I am not as afraid as I thought I would be. I am afraid of the pain. I am afraid of the crowd. But I am not afraid of death itself, because if there is anything after this, you will be there. And if there is nothing, then at least I will not have to live without you." Richard's second letter includes this. "I have been thinking about the first night we met. Do you remember? You wore a blue coat. You were standing by the piano. You smiled at me and I thought I might die right there, just from the happiness of being seen. I would give anything to go back to that moment, to live it again, to choose you again. I would choose you 1,000 times. These are not the words of depraved criminals. These are not the words of men corrupted by unnatural lust. These are love letters. They are as beautiful as any love letters ever written. They are tender and desperate and heartbreaking. They are proof that what these men felt for each other was real, was deep, was worth everything they risked." The night before the execution, the Newgate chaplain visited both men. Robert Holloway, the same man who would later write the pamphlet condemning the executions. Holloway recorded his visits in his diary. The diary is held at the British Library. He wrote about Joseph first. "He is very young. He wept when I entered. He asked me if there was any chance of reprieve. I had to tell him no. He asked me if God would forgive him. I said I believed God was more merciful than men. He seemed comforted by this." About Richard, Holloway wrote, "This one is calm, almost serene. He asked me if I believed in heaven. I said I did. He said he hoped I was right, because he could not bear the thought of losing the man he loved a second time. I did not know what to say to that. I prayed with him. He thanked me. He said I was the first person in months who had treated him like a human being." Holloway sat with both men for hours. He prayed with them. He listened to them. And in his diary he wrote, "I do not understand the crime of sodomy. I do not know if it is truly against God's law or merely against man's. But I know these two men loved each other, and I cannot believe that love is evil. I will attend their execution tomorrow. I will pray for their souls. And I will pray that England will one day look back on this and feel shame." On the morning of November 7th, Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis were brought from their cells and loaded into the cart that would take them to the gallows. They were allowed to sit together for the journey. It was a small mercy. Their hands were bound, but they sat shoulder to shoulder, and for the first time in 7 weeks, they could see each other. The cart moved slowly through the streets from Newgate to the execution site just outside the prison walls. The route was less than a quarter mile, but the journey took 20 minutes. The crowd lined the streets 6 deep. Thousands of people. They had come from all over London. Some had been waiting since dawn. The newspapers estimated the crowd at 15,000, maybe more. It was one of the largest crowds ever assembled for an execution in London. They screamed. They threw things at the cart, rotten vegetables, stones. One man threw a dead cat that struck Joseph Carlo in the chest. The crowd laughed. Joseph and Richard sat pressed together, their shoulders touched. They did not look at the crowd. They looked at each other. Robert Holloway walked beside the cart. He held a prayer book, but he was not reading from it. He was watching the two men. In his diary, he later wrote, "They were holding hands." I do not know when they managed to clasp their bound hands together, but they did, and they held on to each other all the way to the scaffold. The cart stopped at the gallows. The crowd surged forward. The guards pushed them back. Joseph and Richard were helped down from the cart. Helped is perhaps generous. They were pulled down. They stumbled. They were steadied, and then marched up the wooden steps to the platform. The platform stood 8 feet high, wide enough for 12 men to stand. The crossbeam above had 8 nooses hanging from it. Only 2 would be used today. The others swayed slightly in the November wind. There were 4 other men being executed that day. A highwayman, 2 burglars, a man convicted of murder. They were already on the platform. They stood at the far end, away from Joseph and Richard. Even condemned men wanted distance from Molly's. The executioner was James Botting, efficient, professional. He had done this hundreds of times. He placed the nooses around their necks. Joseph first, then Richard. The ropes were rough hemp. They scratched against the skin. Joseph flinched. Richard closed his eyes. Holloway climbed the steps to the platform. He was permitted to say a final prayer. He stood between the two men and he prayed aloud. He prayed for mercy. He prayed for peace. He prayed that God would receive them with love. And then he did something the records note as unusual. He placed a hand on each man's shoulder and he said, loud enough for the front rows of the crowd to hear, "You are not alone. You are seen. You are loved." The crowd booed. Holloway stepped back. Botting checked the nooses one final time. He nodded to the bailiff. The bailiff raised his hand. In the moment before the trapdoor opened, Richard turned his head slightly toward Joseph. The noose restricted movement, but he managed it. And he said something. The witnesses disagree on what. Some say he said, "I love you." Some say he said, "Wait for me." Some say he said nothing at all, that his lips moved, but no sound came. Joseph heard. Whatever it was, he heard. He nodded. Once. A small movement. And then the trap door opened and they fell. Joseph died quickly. His neck broke. 4 minutes. His body swung gently at the end of the rope and then was still. Richard took longer. 7 minutes. His body convulsed. His legs kicked. The crowd watched in silence. Some people looked away. Most did not. When it was over, when both bodies hung motionless, the crowd began to disperse. The spectacle was finished. People drifted away. Street vendors packed up their carts. Parents lifted children down from their shoulders and took them home. The bodies hung for the required hour. Then Botting cut them down. They were loaded onto a cart, taken to a surgeon for the legally mandated dissection, and then someone intervened. We do not know who paid the surgeon. The payment is recorded in the surgeon's ledger, a sum of £5, which was substantial, but the name of the payer is listed only as a friend. That is all. A friend. Whoever it was arranged for the bodies to be released without dissection. Arranged for them to be taken to a church in Bethnal Green. Arranged for them to be washed, dressed in clean linen, and buried together in a single grave. The burial happened at night. No ceremony. No mourners listed in the parish record. Just a brief entry. 2 men, Joseph C. and Richard F., buried this date in the east corner of the churchyard, paid in full by a friend. For 2 centuries the grave was anonymous. The stone said only J.C. and R.F. and the year. No one knew who they were. No one visited. The grave was overgrown, forgotten, until Richter Norton found it. Norton spent decades researching Molly House history. He combed through trial records, parish registers, newspaper archives. He found references to the Vere Street executions. He found the burial record in Bethnal Green. He traced the initials. He confirmed the identities. In 2010, 200 years after the executions, Norton published his findings, and people began to visit the grave. I have been there. I stood at that grave on a cold afternoon in March. The stone is weathered. The initials are barely legible. But someone had left flowers, fresh flowers, pink carnations, and a small rainbow flag tucked into the grass beside the stone. I do not know who left them, but someone did. Someone stood where I stood and said, "I remember you. You are not forgotten." That is what this night is about. That is what all of this is about. Refusing to let them be forgotten. The White Swan is gone. Vere Street is barely recognizable. The London of 1810, the narrow, filthy streets, the disease, the violence, the brutal certainty that love between men deserved death, that London is gone. But the memory remains. The names remain. Joseph Carlo, Richard Francis, James Cook, John Dix, William Amos, Philip Sedgwick, James Dunn. all of them. Every man who walked through the doors of the White Swan, looking for a place where he could breathe. They existed, they loved, they suffered, they died, and 200 years later, we say their names. We say them because they could not, because they lived in a world that gave them no language for who they were, no legal protection, no social acceptance. A world that said their love was a crime, and their existence was an abomination. And still they loved. Still they gathered in that upstairs room and danced and held each other and whispered promises in the dark. Still they risked everything for a few hours of freedom. That courage is staggering when you really think about it. They knew the risks. They had seen other molly houses raided. They had heard about the executions. They knew that discovery meant ruin at best and death at worst. And they went anyway. Because the human need for connection is stronger than fear. Because love insists on existing, even when the world says it should not. Because sometimes you reach a point where hiding is worse than the risk of being seen. The men of Vere Street reached that point, and they paid for it with everything they had. But here is what the British state did not understand. You can execute love, but you cannot kill it. You can drive it underground, but you cannot make it disappear. Every molly house you raid, 2 more will open. Every man you hang, a dozen more will find each other in the shadows and hold on. The Vere Street raid was meant to terrify the molly community into silence. It was meant to be a lesson, a warning, an example. It failed. Within a year, new molly houses were operating. Within a decade, the community had rebuilt itself. The language changed, the locations changed, the level of caution increased, but the fundamental truth remained. Men who loved men would find each other, would create spaces where they could exist, would refuse to disappear. That refusal is the through line of queer history, from the molly houses of Georgian London to the Stonewall riots, to marriage equality to this moment right now. Every generation refusing to disappear, every generation insisting on visibility, every generation creating the spaces they need to survive. We stand on the shoulders of men who wore dresses in shabby pub rooms and called each other Fanny and Kitty and danced waltzes by candlelight, knowing they could hang for it. We owe them everything. The White Swan existed for 8 months. In the grand sweep of history, that is nothing, a blink, a breath. But for the men who gathered there, those 8 months were everything. They were freedom, they were community, they were the chance to be seen and loved for exactly who they were. James Cook gave them that. He opened his doors and he said, "You are welcome here, you are safe here." And for 8 months, they were. And when the doors were kicked in and the runners flooded the room and the men were dragged away in chains, James Cook stood in the center of the wreckage, and he did not run. He did not deny. He stood there and he accepted what was coming because he knew he had done something worth doing. He gave men a place to breathe. He gave them 8 months of freedom. And then he stood in the pillory and he went to prison and he survived. And when he got out, he disappeared from the records. We do not know where he went. We do not know if he lived quietly, carefully, never taking such risks again, or if he found another way to help. Another house, another gathering place. I hope the second one. I hope James Cook spent the rest of his life finding ways to make space for men who had nowhere else to go. I hope he never stopped believing it was worth it. The legacy of Vere Street is complicated. It was a tragedy, a disaster. Men died. Men were ruined. Families were destroyed. But it was also proof that the community existed, that men across London, across England, were finding each other, building networks, creating culture. The authorities wanted to destroy the molly houses. What they actually did was document them. The trial transcripts preserve details that would otherwise be lost to history. We know what the men wore, what they drank, what they whispered to each other. We know because the state recorded it in its attempt to prove depravity. And now, 200 years later, we read those transcripts and we see courage. We see love. We see men insisting on their right to exist. History is strange that way. The records meant to condemn become the records that preserve. The trials meant to shame become the evidence of resistance. Joseph Carlo wrote from his cell that he would choose Richard Francis again, that he was sorry for nothing. That sentence has echoed across 2 centuries. It appears in histories of LGBTQ+ rights. It appears in museum exhibits. It appears on memorial plaques and in pride speeches, because it is the perfect distillation of queer defiance. I would choose you again. I am sorry for nothing. Those words were written by a 24-year-old man waiting to die, a man who had every reason to recant, to beg for mercy, to say he was sorry, and he had made a mistake, and he would never do it again. He did not. He said, I would choose you again. That is the voice we need to hear tonight. That is the voice we need to remember as you drift off to sleep. Not the voice of the prosecutors, or the judges, or the crowd screaming at the pillory. The voice of Joseph Carlo saying, I would choose you again. Because that is the truth that survives. Love survives. It outlasts the laws meant to suppress it. It outlasts the executions and the prisons and the centuries of shame. It outlasts everything. The men of Vere Street have been dead for over 200 years, but their love is still here, in the trial transcripts, in the letters preserved in archives, in the grave in Bethnal Green where someone leaves fresh flowers. They are still here, and tonight, you and I have kept them company. We have said their names. We have heard their stories. We have refused to let them be forgotten. That is all we can do for them now. Remember, bear witness. Say their names out loud. James Cook, William Amos, Philip Sedgwick, James Dunn, John Dix, Richard Francis, Joseph Carlo, and the hundreds more whose names were lost. The men who escaped the raid and never spoke of it. The men who visited the White Swan once or twice and then disappeared back into history. The men who heard about the executions and were terrified into silence. The men who died alone, their desires unspoken, their loves unacknowledged. We remember them too, all of them. Tonight, as you fall asleep, know that you are part of a long history. A history of people who loved when the world said they should not, who gathered in secret rooms and danced and held each other and insisted on their right to exist. You are the inheritor of that courage. You are the proof that they won, that love survived. The British state hanged Joseph Carlo and Richard Francis, but it did not kill what they felt for each other. That love is still here, in the letters, in the grave, in every person who reads their story and thinks, I would have chosen you too. So tonight, when you slip into sleep, spare a thought for the men of Vere Street, for James Cook and his piano and his cheap gin and his 8 months of freedom, for Joseph and Richard holding hands in the cart on the way to the gallows, for the man who called himself Miss Sweetlips and wore a yellow silk gown and danced with grace in a room that smelled of tobacco and hope. They had so little, and they risked everything for it. We have so much, and we owe it to them to remember. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. There are more stories like this one, more names that need saying, more moments of courage that refuse to stay buried. May your dreams be free of pillories and hangings and crowds that scream for blood. May you dream instead of upstairs rooms where men dance together without fear. Of love letters written in the dark. Of 2 men buried together under a stone that says only their initials, waiting 200 years for someone to remember. Good night, and sleep well.